December 24, 1944. Camp Swift, Texas. The Christmas wind carried the scent of pine and dust across the sprawling barracks, where thousands of German prisoners stood behind the wire, eyes fixed on the horizon. The war for them was over, but what they saw beyond those fences would haunt their certainty forever. Trains thundered past, loaded with tanks, jeeps, and crates of munitions. Smoke rose from the factories in the distance, endless and alive. One prisoner, a former panzer commander, whispered under his breath, "Mein Gott, they're still building like the war hasn't even begun." U.S. Army Camp Log. Tech 1944. For years, they had been told America was a nation of jazz and frivolity. A land of amateurs, soft, naive, incapable of sustaining a real war. That illusion shattered the moment they arrived. From the rail yards of Chicago to the shipyards of California, from the assembly lines of Detroit to the wheat fields of Kansas feeding the front, the captured soldiers of Hitler's army witnessed something their propaganda never prepared them for: the colossal machinery of democracy at war. When the first groups of German POWs arrived in 1943, under Operation Bolero's transport network, they came defiant, confident that the Reich would triumph. But even in the prisoner trains, they noticed something unsettling. Every crossing, every depot, every junction they passed seemed perfectly timed. Locomotives ran day and night, refueled and recrewed in minutes. In Germany, a train stops and men argue, one Luftwaffe radio operator later confessed. In America, the train never stops. Bundesarchiv. Prisoner Diary, 1946. By 1944, there were over 425,000 German POWs scattered across the United States. More than 500,000 enemy soldiers living, working and observing a nation mobilized beyond comprehension. The U.S. War Department built over 500 camps from Maine to Arizona, each one an intricate logistical operation complete with schools, hospitals, and workshops. At Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, prisoners helped harvest crops with machines that dwarfed anything in Europe. At Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, they repaired American vehicles using tools so plentiful that even the smallest workshops were better equipped than entire German field depots. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, 1945. To the captured men, the scale was not just industrial, it was psychological. They were accustomed to scarcity, to resourcefulness born of necessity. Their tanks were hand-built, their rifles milled with care, their uniforms tailored. In contrast, the Americans produced with terrifying abundance. They saw rows of Liberty ships being launched faster than U-boats could sink them, aircraft engines stacked like fruit in warehouses, endless convoys of trucks, the steel ants of America, one Wehrmacht mechanic called them. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. The shock deepened when they were put to work. According to the Geneva Convention, POWs could labor in non-military industries. Farmers and factory owners across the Midwest welcomed them as laborers, paying wages credited to their camp accounts. That meant German soldiers found themselves inside the belly of the American war machine, loading grain into freight cars, sewing uniforms, cutting lumber for barracks construction, even maintaining irrigation pumps driven by electric motors far beyond what they'd used in Europe. A former U-boat engineer, assigned to a tool plant in Ohio, reportedly said, "We thought we had mechanized war, but here everything is mechanized. Life itself is mechanized." War Department Civil Affairs Report, 1945. Everywhere they looked, efficiency reigned. Mail delivery arrived daily on time. Food rations, fresh meat, milk, fruit never stopped. In some camps, prisoners were served coffee every morning, a luxury that had vanished from the Reich years earlier. They watched women driving trucks, welding ship hulls, managing accounts, proof that America had mobilized not just men, but society itself. "We lost before we even began," another prisoner would later write, "and we built weapons." They built a civilization of production. Bundesarchiv letter from POW, 1945. The shock for many was existential. Their entire worldview, crafted by Joseph Goebbels' ministry, had told them Americans were lazy consumers, obsessed with comfort. But standing in line at Camp Atterbury's medical clinic, seeing X-ray machines humming, shelves stocked with antibiotics, and uniformed nurses moving with mechanical precision, the myth collapsed. This was not softness. It was power expressed through organization. U.S. Army Medical Report, 1944. Some POWs even began sketching what they saw. A small group of artists in Camp Aliceville, Alabama, painted murals depicting the assembly lines of Detroit, lines that ran 24 hours under blinding lamps, with cranes swinging engines through the air like iron fruit. One mural showed a B-17's fuselage stretched across an entire factory floor, hundreds of riveters working in syncopated rhythm. In Germany, one man builds, a former engineer told a U.S. guard. Here, 10,000. Camp Aliceville Cultural Records, 1945. But it wasn't just the factories or machines. It was the morale. German officers expected resentment from their captors. Instead, they found efficiency wrapped in politeness. Guards addressed them by rank, handed them cigarettes, and enforced discipline with quiet authority rather than cruelty. It bewildered them. In Nazi ideology, strength was synonymous with brutality. Here, strength was systematized, expressed in calm confidence that the machine would never stop. U.S. Army Psychological Operations Report, 1945. At night, when floodlights flickered across the wire, prisoners could hear the distant hum of industry, diesel engines from nearby plants, the metallic rhythm of rail lines. One former artilleryman wrote home, "We hear the war here too, but it sounds different. Not guns, machines, always machines." Bundesarchive, letter intercepted by censors, 1944. Even those loyal to the Reich began to doubt. When news trickled in about the Normandy invasion, they refused to believe it at first. How could the Allies sustain such a force? Yet the evidence was all around them. They saw the logistics behind D-Day mirrored in the landscape of America itself. Railroads humming with precision, endless convoys of trucks, men and women laboring with unshakable rhythm. Office of War Information, 1944. Some German officers asked to study the systems they saw. One was granted permission to observe a Ford plant in Michigan, under supervision, of course. He reportedly watched as a complete bomber rolled off the line every hour and whispered, "We never stood a chance." U.S. War Production Board Report, 1945. By late 1945, as the camps filled with captured men from the collapsing fronts, a quiet transformation took place inside the fences. The arrogance of conquest gave way to something resembling awe. America's industrial might wasn't just material, it was spiritual. It reflected a belief that freedom, when harnessed by coordination and purpose, could outbuild tyranny itself. Yet for every German who marveled, there were others who refused to accept it. "They drown us with machines," one officer spat, "but they will never understand honor." Still, even his defiance carried an undertone of fear. The Reich had measured war by courage and will. The Americans had measured it by output, and the numbers spoke louder than any ideology. Post-war interrogation report, 1946. In the silence of the prairie nights, thousands of captured soldiers looked out from behind barbed wire and realized the truth. The factories, the railroads, the endless food, the calm precision, this was what had crushed them. Not just the bullets and bombs, but a nation that could produce both faster than the world could destroy them. And somewhere, deep inside the American heartland, the real secret of victory was humming quietly, unseen, unbreakable, and still growing. What the prisoners saw was only the surface. Beneath the hum of assembly lines and the order of the camps lay a vast interlocking system, America's hidden advantage. It wasn't a single weapon or machine, but the marriage of innovation and organization, the ability to turn blueprints into armies, raw ore into fleets, and ideas into overwhelming force. The United States had transformed itself into the arsenal of democracy, and for the German prisoners watching from behind the wire, the scale defied comprehension. War Production Board Summary, 1945. The secret began with logistics. From 1942 onward, the War Department coordinated 18 million tons of shipping monthly. Rail lines were synchronized by telegraph and early automatic dispatch systems. Freight cars carrying tanks and artillery moved according to mathematical precision. No idle time, no wasted space. Detroit, Chicago, and Pittsburgh became the iron triangle of war industry. Every rivet has a timetable, read one wartime logistics poster, pinned in factories across the Midwest. Office of Defense Transportation Report, 1943. At the heart of it all was steel. The U.S. produced nearly 90 million tons of it in 1943, 3 times that of the entire Axis alliance combined. The furnaces of Bethlehem, U.S. Steel, and Carnegie, Illinois never cooled. Blast furnaces roared like volcanoes, their fire reflecting against the night sky. Engineers like Charles R. Hook of Armco pioneered continuous rolling processes, pushing productivity beyond anything seen in Europe. German metallurgists accustomed to artisan steelworks could scarcely believe it. "They pour steel like we pour water," wrote one POW who had worked at Krupp before the war. U.S. Steel Industry Bulletin, 1944. From this flood of metal came the machines that broke the Reich's spine. The M4 Sherman tank, maligned by some for its light armor, was built in such numbers and with such mechanical reliability that it embodied the American principle, quantity as a quality of its own. Each weighed 30 tons, with a 75-meter M3 gun capable of firing 20 rounds per minute, and a Continental R975 radial engine producing 400 horsepower. The Detroit Arsenal tank plant, designed by Albert Kahn's engineers and operated by Chrysler, could complete one every 30 minutes. Technical Manual TM 9731A 1943. To the captured German soldiers, used to the precision and complexity of the Tiger or Panther, this was unthinkable. Their tanks were masterpieces, but fragile and slow to build. A single Tiger required over 300,000 man-hours. Size Sherman just 10,000. "They can afford to lose 10 for every one of ours," grumbled a German major during interrogation. And they do not stop coming. Interrogation report U.S. 9th Army, March 1945. But production alone didn't win wars. Coordination did. The Americans had cracked the code of communication. In every convoy, every squadron, every armored column, small black boxes pulsed with invisible power. The FM radio. Developed by engineers at Galvin Manufacturing, later Motorola, the SCR-300 backpack radio revolutionized battlefield control. Operating between 40 and 48 megahertz, it offered clear voice transmission over 3 miles of rough terrain, far surpassing the crackling AM systems used by the Wehrmacht. Signal Corps Technical Bulletin 1944. In the hedgerows of Normandy and the forests of the Ardennes, this invisible thread of speech held entire divisions together. Orders traveled at the speed of sound. A platoon leader could call for artillery in seconds. German intercept teams were baffled. The FM signal bounced unpredictably, resistant to jamming. One captured communications officer admitted, "We could not find them." The air itself obeyed their command. Bundesarchiv Communication Division Report 1945. The prisoners in America soon learned where this miracle came from. In Chicago's West Side plants, rows of women soldered components for SCR-300s, guided by engineers like Daniel Noble and Henry Magnuski. The radios were tested under simulated combat conditions, static generators, heat lamps, vibration platforms, before being shipped to Europe. To the Germans, it was more than technology. It was proof of America's discipline disguised as informality. Motorola Factory Archive 1944, and there was more. The power of the air itself was being weaponized. At factories in Massachusetts and New York, radar engineers, many of them recent graduates barely in their 20s, built systems that could see through night and fog. The SCR-584 radar, operating on microwave frequencies near 3 GHz, guided anti-aircraft fire with terrifying accuracy. During the defense of Antwerp in December 1944, it shot down over 85% of incoming V-1 rockets. Signal Corps Development Report 1945. The Germans, who prided themselves on scientific prowess, were stunned to learn their captors had deployed thousands of such systems. "We had prototypes," one Luftwaffe scientist admitted post-war. They had factories. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey 1946. Inside the POW camps, the prisoners were fed news of these technologies through guarded lectures and American propaganda films. But what impressed them most wasn't the propaganda. It was the infrastructure surrounding them. Electric lights that never flickered, trucks fueled and repaired overnight, fields plowed by tractors powered by gasoline engines, built by the same plants producing aircraft pistons. A single industrial ecosystem. War Department Civil Affairs Bulletin, 1944. This ecosystem would soon manifest its power on the battlefield in one of the most decisive logistical operations of the war, the Red Ball Express. Between August and November 1944, as the Allies surged through France, more than 6,000 trucks, many driven by African-American soldiers, moved 12,500 tons of supplies daily from Normandy to the front lines. Each GMC CCKW deuce-and-a-half truck carried up to 2.5 tons, powered by 270 cubic-inch inline-six engines and capable of 45 men/ph over dirt roads. Quartermaster Course Report 1945. When German POWs captured in France heard of it, they laughed at first. No army, they thought, could maintain such a massive flow of fuel and ammunition without collapsing. But when they reached the camps months later, they saw the truth. America had built entire railroads and depots to feed its armies, with spare parts waiting in crates already stamped for the next campaign. U.S. Army Transportation Command Summary, 1944, one POW, a logistics officer from the 2nd Panzer Division, reportedly studied American freight scheduling maps pinned on a mess hall wall for hours. Finally, he murmured, "They fight like engineers, not warriors." Camp McAllister Observation Log, 1945. This mechanical precision reached its zenith during the Battle of the Bulge, December 16, 1944, Hitler's final gamble. As snow blanketed the Ardennes, German columns struck through the fog, cutting off Allied units and isolating Bastogne. Yet even under siege, the Americans responded not with desperation but with calculation. Within 48 hours, thousands of tons of supplies were rerouted by truck and air. P-47 Thunderbolts strafed advancing columns with uncanny coordination, every squadron guided by radar and FM radio relay. 9th Air Force Combat Report 1945. By December 26th, the 4th Armored Division broke through to relieve Bastogne. The Germans had thrown 200,000 men into the offensive. They lost 100,000. Their tanks ran out of fuel, their logistics shattered. "The Americans moved their supplies like blood through veins," wrote one German captain after capture. "We suffocate in our own brilliance." Bundesarchiv Prisoner Interrogation, John, 1945. As the war's tide turned, those imprisoned in America understood. This was no accident. Behind the scenes, engineers, scientists, and laborers, men and women, had built a war machine powered not by tyranny, but by collaboration. Every invention, from the SCR-300 to the M4 Sherman, from radar arrays to assembly line engines, represented a nation's collective mind at war. National Defense Research Committee Report, 1945, and the Germans realized too late that they had underestimated the true weapon of the United States, not its guns, nor its tanks, but its capacity to learn, organize, and build without end. As 1945 dawned and the Reich crumbled, prisoners across America began whispering among themselves. What would become of a world where this industrial giant no longer slept? The answer would define the next century. Spring 1945. The war was ending. Across the heartland, the fences around America's prisoner of war camps stood under quiet skies. German soldiers, once fierce believers in a 1,000-year Reich, now watched the sunrise over farmlands stretching beyond sight. Victory for their captors was total, but it wasn't the brutality of conquest that broke them. It was the quiet hum of America's machinery. The same rhythm they had heard each night beyond the wire still beat, tireless and unrelenting. War Department Civil Affairs Memo 1945. As news of Hitler's suicide spread through the camps, something strange happened. Many prisoners stood in stunned silence, not because they mourned, but because they finally understood the scale of what they had faced. America's power wasn't confined to battlefields. It lived in every factory, every rail line, every mechanic's hand. "They never stopped," one officer remarked. "They never tired." Post-war interrogation report, 1946. When the war in Europe officially ended on May 8, 1945, over 370,000 German POWs remained on U.S. soil. For months they waited, uncertain of their fate. Yet during that time, they witnessed the full breadth of what had defeated them. Not only the engines of war, but the principles driving them. Where the Reich ruled through fear, America built through faith. Faith in process, teamwork, and invention. That faith, forged in assembly lines and laboratories, was the real weapon of democracy. U.S. Office of War Information, May 1945. In Camp Ruston, Louisiana, groups of prisoners were shown films of liberated Europe. Cities in ruins, children wandering through rubble, smoke curling from shattered cathedrals. The contrast was unbearable. In the camp library, they read newspapers detailing America's plans for reconstruction. The Marshall Plan was still a seed, but the idea was already alive. The belief that rebuilding was as vital as winning. Library of Congress Archives, POW Camp Records, 1945. For some, this vision created an awakening. German engineers imprisoned in Texas and Nebraska began sketching machines inspired by what they had seen. Mass production systems, electric tractors, radio designs. They were encouraged to lecture other POWs, teaching technical skills and mathematics. By 1946, over 120,000 Germans had voluntarily enrolled in these educational programs, many describing them later as the first true democracy we ever experienced. Camp Swift Educational Committee Report. 1946 others, however, carried the shock like a wound. Officers who once commanded tanks or artillery could not reconcile their defeat with the cheerful order around them. One former panzer colonel wrote bitterly, "They fight with numbers and machines, and yet they smile." It is monstrous, this happiness of power. Bundesarchiv, Prisoner Diary, 1946. The truth was more complex. America's abundance had not come without cost. Behind the efficiency lay exhaustion, grief, and sacrifice. In the factories of Willow Run, where one B-24 Liberator had rolled off the line every 63 minutes, women and men worked 12-hour shifts. Accidents were frequent, burnout common. Yet production never faltered. Engineers such as Charles Sorensen and Henry Ford II solved bottlenecks on the fly, reconfiguring assembly lines overnight. The workers themselves became soldiers, fighting fatigue, rationing, and fear with the same resolve as those on the front. War Production Board Records, 1945. This industrial resilience became a psychological weapon as well. Allied analysts later concluded that German morale began to collapse not when bombs fell, but when soldiers realized that every tank destroyed was instantly replaced, every airfield repaired, every loss answered with greater output. Defeat, wrote one American psychologist, was not an event. It was a calculation. U.S. Army Morale Division Study, 1946. German prisoners in the United States saw that calculation firsthand. In camp workshops, damaged trucks and tractors were repaired using spare parts that seemed endless. Supplies arrived before requests were written. Prisoners tasked with maintaining the camp generators were astonished by the availability of fuel and tools. "There is no such thing as shortage here," one recalled. "It is as if the earth itself supplies them." Camp McAllister Mechanical Report, 1945. But it was not just material wealth, it was willpower, codified into procedure. America's ability to mobilize millions and coordinate them without coercion baffled those who had served under totalitarian discipline. In the Reich, obedience was enforced. In America, it was volunteered. The prisoners saw it in the soldiers who guarded them, calm, patient, disciplined without cruelty. They saw it in the civilians who ran the camps, farmers, teachers, engineers, each serving not out of fear but conviction. U.S. Army Psychological Operations Report, 1946. That quiet confidence left its mark. When repatriation began in 1946, thousands of German POWs wrote letters expressing gratitude and confusion. Some spoke of wanting to return and build a Germany like this America, ordered yet free, efficient yet humane. Many would go on to shape the post-war Federal Republic, carrying home lessons learned behind the wire. Engineers who had studied American manufacturing returned to rebuild Volkswagen and Siemens. Teachers trained in POW camp classes helped found technical schools across West Germany. Allied Repatriation Report, 1947. In a way, America's victory was replicated through them. The same industrial principles that produced tanks and ships now helped rebuild Europe's factories and cities. The Marshall Plan, enacted in 1948, extended the same organizational genius outward. Steel replaced bombs, railways replaced convoys, food shipments replaced ammunition. They destroyed with precision, a former prisoner would later say, and rebuilt with the same precision. U.S. Economic Cooperation Administration, 1948. Even those who had resisted the American model eventually acknowledged its inevitability. The Nazi vision of domination had collapsed under its own rigidity. The American model, elastic and dynamic, could bend without breaking. It was not merely superior, it was adaptable. The prisoners who once mocked mass production began to see its deeper meaning. coordination as a form of freedom, technology as the servant of will, not its master. Post-war German Reconstruction Memo 1949. Yet the story did not end in 1945. The legacy of that industrial might would echo through the next half-century. From the factories of Detroit to the research labs of Los Alamos, the systems that had overwhelmed the Reich evolved into the backbone of the Cold War arsenal. Computers replaced radios, missiles replaced tanks, but the principle remained the same. Information, logistics, and production fused into one unbroken chain. U.S. Department of Defense Industrial Mobilization Report 1951. The lessons learned by the German POWs became lessons for the world. Modern wars would no longer be won by bravery alone. They would be won by networks, by data, by the capacity to mobilize thought as swiftly as steel. In the Gulf War of 1991, the same doctrine re-emerged under a new name: network-centric warfare. Radios had become satellites, convoys had become digital supply chains. The lineage traced straight back to the humming radios and tireless machines of 1944. Defense Systems Analysis Report, 1991. For the men who had stood behind the wire, the memory never faded. Some spoke of the sound, the endless low hum of engines in the distance. Others remembered the sight of trains under the Texas sun, loaded with machines bound for a world they could no longer touch. What they had witnessed was more than industrial superiority. It was the triumph of a nation's collective imagination. Bundesarchiv, Prisoner Memoir, 1952. As one former German officer said years later, standing at a reunion in Bonn, "We thought we were fighting soldiers. We were wrong. We were fighting engineers, dreamers, and workers united by a single heartbeat." In that realization lies the true legacy of America's industrial might. It was never about domination. It was about motion, an endless surge of creativity and coordination that turned freedom itself into a weapon. The prisoners who arrived proud and defiant left humbled and changed, carrying with them the understanding that the modern battlefield was no longer just a place of guns and tanks. It was the factory floor, the blueprint table, the steady hand on a radio dial. For in the great wars of the 20th century, it was not the strongest who survived. It was the most organized, the most adaptable, the most determined to build faster than destruction could tear down. And so, behind the wire, under the endless American sky, thousands of defeated men learned the final lesson of their war. In modern conflict, industry is destiny.